All right, so today we're going to dive into something pretty interesting. It's kind of a what-if scenario. Like, what if you took a Silicon Valley CEO,
Mm.
someone used to boardrooms and billion-dollar deals,
hmm
and dropped him right into the middle of international relations? That's exactly what happened with Meg Whitman, former CEO of eBay and Hewlett-Packard, when she became the U.S. ambassador to Kenya. It just makes you wonder, how does that kind of background in business, like how does that shape her approach to diplomacy? Did her experience in like the fast-paced tech world clash at all with the more, traditional world of embassies and treaties and things like that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting case study, isn't it? I mean, her appointment really did signal a shift, this blurring of the lines between business and diplomacy. And she brought this laser focus on economic growth and technology. She saw Kenya as a potential powerhouse in both of those sectors. For her, it wasn't just about handshakes and state dinners. It was about really forging those partnerships, attracting investment and really pushing for Kenya to take a leading role on the global stage.
Yeah, from what I've read, she really hit the ground running, especially when it came to building a strong relationship with the Kenyan president, William Ruto. I'm kind of curious about that. How did that relationship and their shared vision contribute to her overall strategy?
That was definitely a key factor. Both Whitman and Rudo were very much aligned on this idea of Kenya becoming a major player in the global economy. And Whitman, with her business acumen and all of her connections, she was really able to sell that vision to American companies.
Okay, so she's got this grand vision. She's got a strong partnership with the Kenyan president. But how did that actually translate into action? What specific steps did she take to make that vision a reality?
One of her key initiatives was this campaign called Why Africa, Why Kenya? And it was all about attracting U.S. investment by showcasing Kenya's strengths, the burgeoning digital economy, the potential in agriculture,
Hmm.
infrastructure development, and renewable energy. It was a real charm offensive, highlighting all the opportunities for American businesses to partner with Kenyan companies and create this win-win scenario.
This win-win philosophy you mentioned, it seems like that was at the core of her approach. Did it actually work? I mean, were American companies actually buying into this idea of investing in Kenya?
They were, and the results were pretty remarkable. We saw a significant influx of U.S. investment into Kenya, particularly in tech and green energy. Whitman was really instrumental in facilitating those deals, connecting the dots between Silicon Valley and Nairobi's tech scene.
So she's bringing in investment, she's fostering partnerships. Sounds like a diplomatic success story, right? But I know there's another side to this, a more controversial side. Let's talk about those moments where her approach perhaps rubbed some people the wrong way.
Yes, there were definitely some bumps along the road. One of the most notable incidents was her comment about Kenya's 2022 elections being the most transparent in Africa. On the surface, it might have seemed like a positive remark, but it landed terribly, especially with opposition figures like Raila Odinga.
I remember that causing quite a stir. Why was it such a big deal? Was it just a case of poor timing, or was there something more to it?
It was seen as a major diplomatic faux pas. Kenya's political landscape is complex, and for a foreign ambassador to weigh in on the legitimacy of an election, especially one that was hotly contested, it was incredibly insensitive. It came across as taking sides, which is a big no-no in diplomacy.
It sounds like it really damaged her credibility with certain segments of the Kenyan population. Did she ever recover from that misstep, or did it cast a shadow over the rest of her time in Kenya?
It definitely had a lasting impact. It raised questions about her judgment and her understanding of the nuances of Kenyan politics, and it fueled this broader criticism that she was overstepping her bounds and becoming too involved in Kenya's domestic affairs.
That's a delicate balance to strikes, isn't it? Promoting U.S. interests while also respecting the sovereignty of another nation. Speaking of overstepping boundaries, there was also that infamous traffic incident in Mombasa. What happened there, and how did it play out in the court of public opinion?
Ah, yes, the photo op that turned into a viral sensation. Whitman's convoy stopped for her to take a picture at the iconic elephant tusks landmark, causing a massive traffic jam in the process.
I can only imagine the reactions on social media.
Let's just say it wasn't pretty. Kenyans were understandably frustrated by the inconvenience. The whole thing became a meme highlighting this perception of her being out of touch with everyday Kenyan life. To her credit, Whitman tried to make light of the situation, but the damage was done.
So we've got this incredibly driven, business-minded ambassador making waves, achieving significant successes in economic diplomacy, but also stumbling into some pretty high-profile controversies. What's fascinating to me is how these seemingly disparate elements, the wins and the missteps, ultimately intertwined to shape her legacy.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just looking at a list of achievements or a series of blunders. We're exploring a complex story, a unique experiment in diplomacy that ultimately raises more questions than it answers.
And that's what we'll be unpacking further as we continue our deep dive into Meg Whitman's tenure as U.S. Ambassador to Kenya. Stay tuned for part 2. Welcome back. So we're kind of in the middle of dissecting this fascinating experiment, Meg Whitman's time as the U.S. Ambassador to Kenya. And we've seen how she brought this business-minded approach to diplomacy, racking up some impressive wins in economic growth, but also triggering some pretty intense controversies along the way. What I'm grappling with is how those missteps, like that most transparent elections comment, how did that actually impact U.S.-Kenya relations? Was it just bad press, or did it cause some real diplomatic damage?
Well, the immediate fallout was definitely negative. Raila Odinga, the opposition leader, he was furious. He accused Whitman of undermining Kenyan sovereignty and interfering with their internal affairs. There were protests, calls for her expulsion. It was a real diplomatic firestorm.
I didn't realize the backlash was that severe.
Yeah.
So beyond the immediate outrage, what were the long-term consequences? Did it damage trust between the two countries?
It definitely strained relations, at least in the short term. The Kenyan government had to publicly distance itself from Whitman's comments, and there was a sense that the U.S. was meddling where it didn't belong. It took a lot of damage control to smooth things over.
What could she have done differently? Obviously, hindsight's 20/20. But was there a way she could have avoided that whole mess?
Diplomacy is all about nuance, right? It's about reading the room, understanding the sensitivities. And in this case, Whitman's comment, however well-intentioned it was, it lacked that nuance. Perhaps a more seasoned diplomat would have recognized the potential for offense and chosen their words more carefully.
It's interesting because some argue that this whole business leader as diplomat approach is inherently flawed. They say that business and diplomacy are just too different, with different goals, different timelines, different ways of operating. What's your take on that?
Yeah, there's definitely a tension there. Business is often about driving quick results, maximizing profits, taking calculated risks. Diplomacy, on the other hand, is about building relationships, fostering trust, navigating complex political landscapes. It's a much slower, more delicate dance.
So are you saying that Whitman's business instincts actually worked against her in some cases?
I think it's more complicated than that. Her business acumen was undoubtedly an asset when it came to attracting investment and promoting economic growth. But perhaps that same drive for results led to some impulsive decisions, a lack of sensitivity to the cultural and political nuances. It's like she brought this move fast and break things mentality to a realm where a more measured approach is often needed.
That's a great point. It's like she was playing chess while everyone else was playing Go. But at the same time, maybe that boldness, that willingness to shake things up is what allowed her to achieve those economic breakthroughs in the first place. It's a real double-edged sword, isn't it?
Precisely. And that's the crux of the debate about this new breed of diplomats, right? Do they bring much needed pragmatism and efficiency to a field that's often bogged down in bureaucracy? Or do they risk disrupting delicate diplomatic balances and causing more harm than good?
Do you think there's a way to strike a balance? To have someone who understands both the language of business and the diplomacy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, I think Whitman's experience, for all its triumphs and tribulations, it has been a valuable case study in that ongoing search for balance. It's highlighted both the potential and the pitfalls of this business-minded approach to diplomacy.
We've been focusing a lot on the U.S. perspective here. But what about Kenya? How did Whitman's tenure impact their view of the U.S.? Did they welcome this focus on economic growth and investment? Or did they feel like they were being treated more like a business opportunity than a sovereign nation?
Well, it's important to remember that Kenya, like many African nations, they're wary of neocolonialism, of being exploited for its resources. So there was definitely a segment of the population that viewed Whitman's approach with suspicion. They saw this push for investment as a way for U.S. companies to profit at Kenya's expense.
So it wasn't just about whether her approach was effective, but also about how it was perceived, about the optics of this whole business of diplomacy thing. Did those concerns about exploitation overshadow the potential benefits of economic growth and partnership?
It's a complex equation. On the one hand, there was undeniable progress in terms of economic growth, job creation, and technology transfer. But on the other hand, there were valid concerns about whether those benefits were being distributed equitably, whether they were truly serving Kenya's long-term interests.
It's a reminder that diplomacy isn't just about striking deals and boosting GDP. It's about building relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. And that's something that perhaps got lost in translation in some of Whitman's more controversial moments.
Absolutely. Ultimately, her legacy is going to be judged on whether her successes in driving economic growth outweigh the damage caused by her missteps and the broader concerns about her approach. And that's something that historians and political scientists will be debating for years to come.
So we've explored the successes, the controversies, and the complex legacy of Meg Whitman's time as U.S. ambassador to Kenya. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to know what stood out to you most in all of this. What was the biggest aha moment for you?
For me, it's the realization that the world of diplomacy is changing, and it's changing fast. The lines between business, politics, and international relations are blurring, and we're going to see more figures like Meg Whitman with their unconventional backgrounds and their disruptive approaches stepping onto the global stage.
That's such a great point. It's like we're witnessing the birth of a new era of diplomacy,
Hmm.
one where the rules are being rewritten and the players are coming from unexpected places. And that in itself is incredibly exciting, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, what will the next chapter of this story hold? What new challenges and opportunities will this evolving landscape of diplomacy bring?
Well, those are questions we can all ponder as we continue to observe and analyze the ever-shifting dynamics of the global stage. We'll be right back after a quick break to wrap up this fascinating deep dive into Meg Whitman's tenure as U.S. Ambassador to Kenya. Welcome back. We've been unpacking Meg Whitman's time as the U.S. Ambassador to Kenya, a story full of big wins, some stumbles, and ultimately a lot of questions about the future of diplomacy itself. It's like she cracked open this whole debate about what makes an effective diplomat in the 21st century. Do you need like a deep understanding of a region's history and culture? Or is it more about being a savvy deal maker, someone who can forge those economic partnerships?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question. I mean, Whitman's experience really highlights that tension between those two approaches. On the one hand, you can't deny her successes, in boosting trade and attracting investment, but then you have those missteps, the cultural clashes, the perception that she was prioritizing business interests over diplomatic sensitivities. It really begs the question, what's the right balance?
It feels like we're at this crossroads where the traditional playbook of diplomacy is being challenged by these new forces of globalization, technology, and economic power. And Whitman, whether intentionally or not, she kind of became a symbol of that shift.
Absolutely. Her tenure sparked this larger conversation about the role of business in shaping foreign policy. Should we embrace this trend of appointing CEOs and business leaders to diplomatic posts? Or are we risking long-term damage by prioritizing those short-term economic gains?
I'm curious, what do you think this means for countries like Kenya? Are they seeking diplomats who understand the intricacies of global finance? Or are they looking for something more than just a business partner?
I think it's a mix of both. African nations like Kenya, they are eager to attract investment and participate in the global economy, but they also want to be treated as equal partners, not just sources of cheap labor or raw materials. They want their voices to be heard on the global stage, not just in the boardroom.
So it's not just about who the diplomat is, but also the mindset they bring to the role. It's about understanding the power dynamics at play and approaching those relationships with sensitivity and respect.
Exactly. And I think that's where Whitman's approach sometimes fell short. She brought this incredible energy and drive, but perhaps lacked the cultural awareness and the diplomatic finesse to really navigate those complexities.
So as we look ahead, what lessons can future diplomats, whether they come from the world of business or traditional foreign service, what can they learn from Whitman's experience?
I think the key takeaway is that diplomacy in the 21st century, it demands a nuanced blend of skills. You need that sharp business acumen, the ability to forge deals and drive economic growth. But you also need cultural intelligence, the ability to build relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. And perhaps most importantly, you need humility, a recognition that you're not just representing a company or an industry, but an entire nation, and that your actions have far-reaching consequences.
That's such a powerful insight. It's not enough to just be a good negotiator or a charismatic leader. You need to be a listener, a learner, and a bridge builder. You need to approach each interaction with a deep understanding of the historical context, the cultural nuances, and the human impact of your decisions.
Precisely. And I think Whitman's story, with all of its complexities and contradictions, it serves as a valuable case study in that ongoing evolution of diplomacy. It forces us to grapple with those tough questions, to challenge our assumptions, and to rethink what it truly means to be an effective representative on the global stage.
And for our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked some of those same reflections in you. Meg Whitman's tenure as U.S.